Sometimes it seems like all they ever talk about on the news is violent crime. There's a robbery here, a murder there, and the statistics are not good as far as crime is concerned, but believe it or not, our current state of crime is not as bad as it's ever been. In the early 1990s, we actually saw the worst crime statistics in our nation's history. Even though some of the numbers aren't as bad now as they were, say, 25 years ago, many of the numbers that were decreasing since the 90s have now stopped decreasing and are again on the rise. This morning I want to specifically look at the crime of murder. Rather than throw a bunch of statistics at you, I hope to just put it in perspective this way. If this is an average day, then that means in the short time since this service began, we could expect one person in the United States to have been murdered. Now, if you project that over a whole year, you come out to some 17,000 murders in 1 year in our country alone. So we turn on the news and we see all these shocking stories, such as the Las Vegas massacre that happened a couple of weeks ago. And we still have trouble coming to grips with that kind of thing. We wonder what possesses a person to act in that way. And we can't really put into words the sorrow that we feel for those who were affected by it. Because these people just went to a concert hoping to enjoy some music, have some fun, not hurt anyone, and before the day is over, 58 die and 489 are injured because of one madman. The results of hatred and anger can be seen in the casualties, but do we ever think that there was something deeper that led to that man's decision to kill and injure all of those people? The man didn't all of a sudden do this on a whim without carefully planning out his attack. He had to book his flight to Las Vegas. He had to purchase the weapons and the ammunition. He had to secure the hotel room and get everything lined up for his attack. Now, have you ever considered this? What if we could turn back the clock to October 1st when that happened, and what if that man was in his hotel room getting everything set up to carry out his attack, but before he could open fire, what if police had stormed into his room and arrested him because they were tipped off to what he was intending to do? Would that man in that case still be guilty of murder if he never opened fire? That's what we're going to look at this morning after we first go to the Word of the Lord and see what Jesus Christ himself has to say about it in the Sermon on the Mount. So we'll read in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly I say to you, you will by no means get out of there until you have paid the last penny. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Amen. So what's the answer to our question? If that man who killed all those people on October 1st was stopped beforehand, would he still be guilty of murder? Well, in verse 22, Jesus says, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. So in short, the answer is yes. He would still be guilty of murder, and we'll get into that later. But for now, when Jesus on that day is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, he's pointing out the hypocrisy of people like the Pharisees, people who were very legalistic. They were concerned with following the letter of the law, but not so much in obeying the spirit of the law. Let me put it this way. I'm sure you all have some kind of a situation from your childhood where you have an annoying sibling who's poking you and just being annoying. So what you do, you appeal to the authority of the house, and you say, "Mom, she's touching me." And in my case, I had 2 annoying sisters to deal with, so that's why I'm using the she in there. What does Mom do? Mom says, "Stop touching your brother," or, you probably know what happens. You don't expect your annoying sibling to all of a sudden stop being annoying, and in my case, I've just come to learn that's just who she is, okay? So instead of touching you, she acts like she's going to touch you, but stops a centimeter short in front of your eyeball, blocking your vision. And you say, "Mom, she's touching me again," but she responds, I am not touching you, that kind of thing. To be a kid, The sibling is technically correct. She is not touching you, but is that all that Mom wanted to stop? No, she wanted to stop all the fighting, all the bickering, and all the nonsense, but she just wants to stop the imminent problem by saying, "Stop touching him." However, the fact that Mom didn't clarify that she wanted all the fighting to stop opens the door for the legalist to swoop in and interpret the rules literally rather than generally as they were intended. You see, behind legalism is a heart that wants to do what I want to do, so I'm going to look for every opportunity to continue doing what I want to do, regardless of what the rules or the law say. This is a segue to a discussion about the Pharisees. They were a group of Jews who were organized around the time of Jesus, who, contrary to popular opinion, intended to devote themselves to lives of holy living. But the problem that inevitably arises when people try to follow the law is that most laws aren't specific enough to address all the possibilities that can arise. So the Pharisees, like anyone else, began to take advantage of loopholes and vaguely written laws. Now just look at our Constitution of the United States as an example. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects our rights to free speech. And you do not see anything very specific in the writing of the Founding Fathers. The Constitution does not clarify what speech is and what free is. First Amendment is on the screen for your reading there, and it just says, or abridging the freedom of speech. Doesn't say what that is. So what happens is, through the years, things happen and people will sue other people when they believe that their rights have been infringed upon. Sometimes that case goes the whole way to the Supreme Court, and they have to interpret what they believe free speech is. For instance, the courts have held through the years that yelling fire in a crowded theater when there is none just to cause a scare is not protected free speech. On the other hand, you have gay rights groups who say that refusing to bake a cake somehow violates someone's freedom of speech. Maybe that will go to the Supreme Court someday. I don't know. And there's a lot of other examples of that I'm sure we're all aware of. But if we go back to the Pharisees, the legalist will take it upon himself to clarify what God meant in God's law. That's what we're concerned about here. And as always seems to happen when man puts himself on God's throne to tell others what God would think or say about this, it always seems to come out sounding more like what man would say than what God would say. Take God's commandment against murder, for example. The Pharisees had determined that anything short of actually taking their life was allowable. So to them, sin occurred once the person actually died. Applying this to the Las Vegas massacre, in the hypothetical situation that I posed earlier, where the police broke in and stopped him before he pulled the trigger, the Pharisees would have said he was not guilty of murder since he didn't kill anyone. That's why it's clear that the extent of the Pharisees' religion was based solely on outward appearances. In other words, they could harbor as much hatred in their hearts as they wanted as long as they didn't end someone's life. And the problem that we encounter when we judge according to the law is this, that the law can only judge the outward actions and not what is in our hearts. That's what Jesus is getting at when he says God knows our hearts, and murder begins in the heart. Murder is born of these hateful, evil feelings that were nurtured. And sometimes we act on the feelings, and sometimes we don't. But even if we don't act on these hateful feelings, we have still committed a murder in our hearts. Jesus said that the feelings behind our actions are very important. Many people in society are just like the Pharisees, where they don't really want to get at the root of the problem. In the immediate aftermath of the Vegas attacks, anti-gun activists said that the tragedy is another reason why we need gun control. But they were met on the other side of the issue by those who defend the right to bear arms through the Second Amendment. Not making a political statement here about gun rights and gun control. Just to say that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes it very clear that these evil shootings begin in the heart and not in the gun. Making it more difficult to purchase a gun may or may not have an effect on homicides. I don't know. But I can guarantee you that if we change the human heart by the love of Jesus Christ, that is going to have a guaranteed effect on the number of homicides. Try replacing the anger that is rooted in the heart with love for our brothers and sisters, and then see if there is a dramatic effect all throughout society. Now, speaking of guns, did you know that firearms date back to the year 1364, 653 years ago? However, that's not when the first murder was committed. Man has been killing man for the last 5,000 or more years of civilization. The Bible details the very first murder, which was between the brothers Cain and Abel, back in the book of Genesis. The story shows what happens when anger in the heart is not dealt with swiftly, and when it festers in there and it's not controlled. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament writes to the church in Ephesus, "Be angry and sin not." So he's telling us it's okay to have these feelings of anger, but it's not okay to sin as a result of it. God created us to feel anger, but those emotions of anger can drive us to do good things, like to right a wrong, or it can drive us to do very bad things, like take someone else's life. What we read in Genesis 4 is that both Cain and Abel brought offerings to the Lord. And God accepted Abel's offering, but we don't know really why he rejected Cain's offering. The fact that Cain was rejected by God made him furious with rage. In Genesis 4 verse 5 it says, Cain's countenance fell. Now when I read that, it doesn't sound too bad. Just sounds like, okay, he was sad. He had a fallen countenance. You know, like my countenance falls when I go for a Twinkie and find out that there are none left. I mean, my countenance falls then, okay? That's not what we're talking about here, okay? The literal meaning behind those Hebrew words is that Cain was literally throwing himself on the ground with rage. When we read further in verse 8 of Genesis 4, the Bible says, "And it came to pass," well, that Cain rose up against Abel and killed him. As an aside, the Bible does not tell us how Cain killed Abel, but I'm pretty sure that Cain did not use Dirty Harry's 44 Magnum either. So the words, "and it came to pass," tell us that time had passed. This was not an immediate event after the offerings were made. During that time, Cain's feelings of rejection was brewing in his heart, and he allowed it to take root. And all of this was happening on the inside, but on the outside, no one was aware of any of this until he actually acted on it, rose up, and killed his brother. Of course, Jesus condemns literal murder, but in the Sermon on the Mount, he also broadened the definition to include our feelings towards others, because he knew they are where murder begins. In verse 22, Jesus says, "Whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' should be in danger of the council, but whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hellfire." If you've ever looked at this verse in a study Bible, you might see some kind of a footnote about the word "Raca," saying that it doesn't directly translate into English, and that is true, but there's still meaning to this word. You see, what really is behind "Raca" is a tone of voice, the way that they say it. And to explain this, back in the 1980s, you may remember a movie called 3 Men and a Baby. And in this movie, you had Tom Selleck, Ted Danson, and Steve Guttenberg, who are raising a little infant girl. And there's a scene in this movie where Tom Selleck is rocking the baby to sleep after giving her a bath, and he thinks it's a good idea to read aloud to the baby to stimulate her intelligence. And I believe it was Steve Guttenberg who walks into the room, and he hears Tom Selleck reading in a very soft tone of voice to the baby, and as he gets closer, he realizes that what Tom Selleck is reading to the baby is a very bloody and violent scene of a novel. But he's saying it in a very soft tone of voice. So he comes in and he's like saying, "What are you reading to her?" And in the same tone of voice, soft tone of voice, Tom Selleck responds, "It doesn't matter what you read, it's the tone of voice you read it in." Okay? That's the same idea behind "Raca." It's like if someone is shouting in anger at me, I don't really need to know those exact words. I can just tell from the tone of voice that it's nothing very flattering. It has been said that if you translate the word "Raca" to the best of our ability, it would be something like calling someone a nitwit, a bonehead, or a brainless idiot. In short, the only reason you're going to use this word is to hurt another person. And Jesus tells us that's not a loving way to communicate to another person, so we ought not be doing that. I want to close shortly by saying that by the time we leave this sanctuary this morning, another person will be literally murdered in the United States, making it to this hour. But I ask you, in this country, in the world, in that time period, how many persons have actually been murdered on the inside? Probably too many to count. Back in seminary, I had a class where we had a feet washing ceremony and the Lord's Supper, observing the ordinances. And I remember, I'll never forget, that when the elements were passed, there was one man, one of the first ones to take. He stood up and he says, "I refuse to take this before I apologize to the professor." He had the professor in another course at the same time, and he said he was harboring these bad feelings towards him. And he said he just could not partake of the Lord's Supper without coming clean and apologizing for his feelings on the inside. I've never seen anyone do that before or since. We should not ever engage in worship of God when we have these kind of feelings towards another person. We don't always have to do it in such a public way as he did, although there's certainly nothing wrong with the way that he did it. Before I accepted Jesus in my life, I cannot tell you how many times that I harbored these kind of feelings towards others. But once I became a child of God, I learned to let go of these feelings and to deal with my anger by reminding myself that I never ever would actually want this person to literally die, so I ought not kill them in my mind either with my feelings about them. I never know if this person is truly saved or not, so that's why I want to give that person plenty of time to make amends with the Lord and with anyone else. When we look at our feelings, where I used to feel anger, I really have replaced that with pity quite often, because my prayer is that if they don't have the love of Jesus Christ in their heart, they may not then be sealed by the Holy Spirit, in which case I pray that they have enough time to repent before it is too late. Let us now go to the Lord in prayer.